Can technology be bad? And is modernity making people happy? These are some of the questions that are very, very central to whether or not we should continue to press on with technological progress in the future. And today, in episode 10 of the Rhetoric Reviewed podcast, we're going to be discussing the state of being of the modern human by going over first an overview on the current state of technology, the trends that we see in modern human mental health and demographic trends. Then we'll discuss Rat Utopia, which is a very, very interesting experiment done in the 1960s, which represents where humanity might go, and finally go into some of the lessons from modernity. Chapters are in the comments or in the description down below, so feel free to check those out and skip to whichever part you feel necessary. So first, I want to go over these two essential questions that we have that we need to be exploring to fully understand this topic. So number one, can technology be bad? So we discussed this extensively in episode 2 of this progress called The New Progress, which I urge you to check out. We talked about how technology has historically been really slow in its development, but recently it's been exponential in its speed. It's not only been exponential in its speed, but also its quality. The magnitude of the changes we see every single week, every single day, every single minute with things like AI, virtual reality, augmented reality, all these different medicine, all these different things show truly how technology is impacting us today. And one of the biggest things that technology has created is the World Wide Web or the internet. And what we see now is the negative effects of some of the products made on the internet, such as social media. It's been made clear throughout the years the detrimental effects social media has had on the minds of our youth. Facebook, Instagram, X, TikTok, all of these things are degrading the mental health of our youth and is making the general societal standard much, much lower and much, much worse. But there's a reason for all of this, you see. And we'll get into this very soon. But first, let's weigh on the good parts of technology and some of the negatives. So as we discussed in episode 2, some of the negatives of technology are that technology has the power to change the way we interact with lives and especially social structures, which can cause certain amounts of discomfort, disarray, and general societal confusion on what to do next and how we can treat these new technologies. This is natural, but because of how fast it is now, we don't have time to adapt and truly learn about the big and more important parts of the technologies we're introducing, such as their negative effects. Should we have been more careful with the World Wide Web? Sure. But that's not the truth right now. That's not the case, and that's not what history has gave us. So we need to work within what history has gave us and try to put our best foot forward. However, there are certainly good parts of technology, especially in the medicine department, which we've discussed multiple times throughout our podcast history. Medicine has improved hundredfold ever since we discovered that medicine is something that actually exists and that viruses aren't simply punishments or unnatural force. Since we discovered bacterium and viruses, it's been very easy for us to actually systematically weed out certain diseases that are virus or viral or bacterium based. And recently, one of the biggest metrics for this, one of the best metrics for not only for viral and bacterial health, but also just general hygiene and sanitation, is infant mortality. So infant mortality is the rate at which children die in their first few weeks to months of life, often due to either malnutrition, disease, or sanitation. And this has been a problem over history. In fact, until around 1900s, over a majority of kids in a certain family died before reaching adulthood, whether this is age 7 or within the first few months, and even mothers dying due to birthing issues. It's been a great issue. However, if you see in the visual here, and if you're listening, this basically shows that since 1754 to 2022, across India, Brazil, the US, France, UK, and Sweden, infant mortality has gone from about 40 to 50% to zero, essentially zero. The amount of infants dying is now not a norm, but a tragedy. The very fact that we treat infant mortality and kids and infants dying during childbirth as a tragedy really exacerbates how good we have it otherwise. It's such an outlier that its very existence is appalling to us moderners. And this is one of the best, truly one of the best metrics because it really represents the totality of health and how not only you're born, but how you continue throughout life. You're not only passing the first stage of childbirth, but you're also moving on to, defeat smallpox at a young age, at the child's age 7 if you were back in the day. But now we don't have those worries because of vaccines and modern medicine. So prosperity is definitely up. Despite the fact that inequality still remains rampant, we still have the very base fact that that the 90% present rate before the 1900s or the Industrial Revolution is nowhere near that number. While many still do live in poverty, about 20%, at least in America, depending on which, of course, poverty standard you use, the current standard of living is still so much higher than it was centuries ago, and this isn't to be ignored. The rate of improvement in the past was not the same as the rate of improvement in the last 100 to 200 years. So given this, are there some ways that technology and these recent developments can be damaging? The answer is absolutely. So what the Industrial Revolution did, one of the most important parts, is that it helped us urbanize. So urbanization is partly good. It drives up immigration, makes it more centralized for finance, and also makes it easier to have all the industrial workers in one place, meaning transportation costs are less. It's an all-in-one solution which lets you get maximum efficiency of the labor force. And urbanization has also other good effects, of course, like, consolidating power, allowing for greater projects to be done, better transportation systems, better communication. But as we'll see soon, it's had detrimental effects. So before we get into the reason or the possible psychological reason why we go through all these things in modernity, which is the rat utopia experiment, let's first look at some mental health effects trends and some things we see in society today, especially in the youth, which is I'm going to be focusing on because these are the people brought up in the most modern era of history, which is basically people who grew up with mass media, which can be either television or I think it's more applicable to the widespread use of social media. So recently in a video, I got a comment saying that it's people's choice to stay off social media. And absolutely that is so. You may, but you can go back and as far as say, of course, you can live like the Amish, which is people who don't have any technology, or at least modern technology. However, this is extremely difficult because maybe 10 years ago this was possible. A phone was not necessary, even for kids. But now, today, so much is being done academically on the professional level that requires a phone for not only quick communication, but for also appliance and productivity reasons. There's some things that simply can't be done without owning a smartphone and having access to social media apps, which allows you not to only to network, but allows you to be part of the digital social circles that dominate today's conversation. Of course, had these things not been invented in the first place, we would be in a better place, possibly. However, given that these already exist, to go back and say, as we discussed in, again, the episode 2, The New Progress, it's simply preposterous to say we should go back and remove all of this. So it's also, of course, economically impossible as well, but to people, they will not accept moving backwards for no reason, or no perceived reason at least. So enough of that, let's go back into the desensitization of the youth. So first, let's look at the current suicide rate. This is one of the biggest metrics for general mental health and well-being, but if you can see here in the graph, since 2007, the amount of suicides for young people have gone up drastically, while the amount for middle-aged to older people have gone down. So why is this? This could be that people are just more unhappy, and that's obviously true, as we'll get into. But the conditions for such a high rate have to be set by more general sociological factors that allow us to actually make this kind of general claim. This is from the CDC, of course, so it's a more comprehensive view of this statistic. So among the multitude of reasons, general mental health declining is one of them, but it's also the certain social situations people find themselves in. Alienation, loneliness, perhaps more drugs and opioid use in their areas. And all of these are most prevalent in urban areas. And it's quite strange. It doesn't seem, it's kind of counterintuitive. How can an urban area be the most isolated, atomized, depressed? But if you really think about it, it kind of makes sense. In urban areas, it's obviously very high paced. You have a very strong focus on industry, production, professionalism. And a part of this is, of course, the struggle to make ends meet. If you look at the apartment costs in places like New York City, for example, which is the biggest city in America, you're going to find that, yes, indeed, or is it the biggest? Los Angeles? Well, whatever. One of the biggest cities and most important cities in America, rent is very high, so are mortgage payments, right? If you choose to mortgage out a house. And what this does is it creates a hyper-focused individualism where you need to focus on your own needs first. And often this comes with the unexpected consequence of loneliness, which is only exacerbated by excessive social media use. And of course, there's a difference between a loneliness and being alone. Being alone can be described as the choice to be either single, isolated, limited social interaction. But loneliness is when there's no deep connection between people due to multiple, of course, sociological factors, which I can't get into here because I am not even close to being well informed enough to even speak on it lightly. But ultimately, it's very clear right now that happiness is on the low. And American happiness, as we can see from these two graphs here, continues to slide, especially among the youth, and it's really tragic. If you look at the second graph on the bottom here, for those of our viewers who can't see because you can't see the video right now, it shows a decent spike in the about 10-15 years ago, but then a huge drop down ever since the COVID pandemic, or not even before the COVID pandemic, but leading up to the COVID pandemic. The study was conducted from 1991 to 2017, and even by 2017, we had dropped down to the 1991 levels. It's at a consistently low trajectory. So what this represents is that currently there is, even the CDC has, I believe it was the Surgeon General in the 2020s, who declared a loneliness epidemic. And this is strange, right? Normally epidemics are things like, truly, the pandemic, like the coronavirus, Ebola even, or, the flu, all of these things. But loneliness, a mental condition, not even a social condition, can this be considered a epidemic? And the answer is yes, according to the Surgeon General at least, because loneliness has multiple, as we learn more and more about mental health effects and there's more focus on it now, we discovered that there's actual biochemistry going on with our feelings and the way we perceive reality. And if this is affected, that impacts our our everything, the way we interact with others, ourselves, how hard we can try, our output, our effort levels, then yes, it can be declared an epidemic. So it is a serious issue right now, and there's more apathy, depression, and all of this is for a reason, right? Obviously, America is still, as most Western countries are, developed countries are, centralized around urban areas, and these are where most urban, suburban areas, and these are where most studies are being held. And therefore, this reflects us urban areas, because that's where all the population is. There haven't been many comprehensive studies on, or at least enough comprehensive studies on the mental health of the rural areas, at least of America, due to its sparsely populated nature and the fact that each region of America, for example, the Midwest, the Deep South, the Rust Belt, the West, the North, Alaska, Greater New England, Maine, all of these more rural areas, right? Like technically New York's a rural state, other than New York City. All these rural areas haven't been explored because they don't have a common theme. However, when you get to more cosmopolitan cities like Los Angeles, New York City, of course these cities have their own culture and character, but they still have similar social structures due to the fact they are all urbanized cities, which share the common theme of modernity, whether it's modern buildings or, it's Sydney to New York City to London to Berlin. Modernity looks the same when it comes to urbanization, more or less. Right? But ultimately, what this tells us is that there's a current issue right now, especially youth to middle-aged people, even to older generation, mental health wise. And this isn't just because we are so weak or there's microplastics in our food, right? Which of course could be a factor, but the main factor is that there's deep underlying psychological reasons, as we'll get into right now, about why this might happen. So I'm going to now describe the experiment of rat utopia. So this was done by, oh my god, his name, John Calhoun? Doesn't seem right. Calhoun, Stephen? Well, Calhoun in 68 to 70 in the 1900s. So this was, to set some context to begin with, this experiment wasn't conducted at the peak or as we reach into the hype about overpopulation. So in the 60s, overpopulation of the Earth was a big issue. The growth at that time of the boomer generation, or at least maybe Gen X as well, depending on how you classify it. Yes, this generation, the generation prior, was the biggest ever. Post-war prosperity, at least in America, created a huge baby boom that led to so much being good for that generation. Greater labor meant you could probably have lower taxes because you have more output in general, and you don't need to fund social security at a higher rate because this other generation was smaller. You had more prosperity, more business, higher demand because of the war previously, and overpopulation at the rate the population growth at the rate they were experiencing did leave them in danger of overpopulation. So given this, Radiotopia was an example of how mouse sociology and psychology might affect humans in a more, deep lying reason. Of course, we are rational, or we like to think so as humans, but we are ultimately decided by our most, um, deep down evolutionary instincts. For example, it's been seen that when male virginity rates or late marriage rates decline or rise, you're going to find that there's different areas of social stability if it becomes too hard to reproduce or too hard to make enough products so you can actually afford to reproduce. Bad things happen politically, revolutionarily, sociologically, philosophically. There's shifts in culture that are a direct representation of us not being able to fulfill our evolutionary need. So given this, Radiotopia was an experiment where in a certain, I believe it was like a few square meters of area with a bunch of housing areas, you had a few pairs of mice to start the experiment. And the most important part about this is abundance. So what is abundance? It means you have unlimited resources, or at least enough resources that's comparably, infinite compared to scarcity, right? We might have inequality now, but we still have complete abundance compared to the peasants of the 1850s in Russia, for example, or maybe even the yeoman farmers in the 1830s. Notoriously, a lot of white people were poor in the South, in rural America. So what happened is this experiment between 68 and 70 was done multiple times. Obviously, apparently these societies that these mice formed fell apart every 500 days, approximately. So in each time, the population bloomed to about 2200. And after this period, there was this is extremely disheartening and kind of scary, but social collapse at the mouse level. So we might think, mice are so much less advanced than us, how can we compare ourselves? But it's been shown multiple times that mice are extremely intelligent and they're actually comparable to humans, right? So had this been done with some in their small, so it's really easy to experiments on them, and obviously we couldn't do this on humans. But let's talk a bit more and see how this might affect us. So some of the findings that Calhoun found was that as time went on and as the population reached this a tipping point about 2200, there began to become, as overcrowding happened, like urbanization, it became the fact that the female mice became more aggressive while male mice became more meek, or they were obsessed with grooming themselves, right, making themselves keep clean and stuff. And so among males, there became a leveling off. There was a severe difference. So instead of there being an even distribution of what we call, at least in the animal kingdom, alpha, omega, and beta males, there was a huge disparity. There was no middle. There was extremes on both sides. So the alpha males would either they would famously rape both male and female mice with no regards, just for the fun of it. Meanwhile, the beta males were unable to do anything and tried to just scrounge off the scraps, of course, which they were infinite, and live in fear. On the other hand, the omega, or I guess the offshoot males, were something called the beautiful ones. So these are mice who survived the chaos of often fights, cannibalism, even in mice culture, of course, and social breakdowns, and they didn't do anything, literally anything, evolutionarily useful other than take care of themselves. So the reason they're called the beautiful ones by Calhoun is because they were perfect. They groomed themselves all day, had no purpose, did not procreate, did not look to create more. They did not look to feed themselves beyond what's necessary. Social hierarchy. They didn't look to do any of these things and just focus on themselves. So, and very individualistic in this overcrowded environment. And what's interesting, I think, is among females, violence increased towards men and amongst themselves, and violence in all manners. And this even impacted sometimes onto their children, where many young mice died due to their mother's lack of caring, or either lack of caring or negligence, or straight up violence against them. And we're not at this point yet, nowhere near. But we do see a leveling off of a similar leveling off where we've talked about in 2 videos ago, I believe, about overpopulation. That the current rates and projections show that our society will fall off population-wise very soon. By 2100, we might even half, depending on the country you live in. And we've also seen that, for example, male testosterone levels are at an all-time low, right? And however, this doesn't mean that there's no people at the top or people at the bottom. But if the general level is falling, this indicates a trend over the last 30 years, right, since 1990. And this is undeniable. Is this possibly a similar reaction by humans of overcrowding? Possibly. And something I feel that is the most uncanny about this is that the fact that these mice, after a certain point, stopped breeding or caring about procreation. How could this happen? I thought that, evolutionarily, all creatures were meant to procreate because that's what their evolutionary purpose is. So how could this happen? How could we create this situation where where this evolutionary need is not being able to be fulfilled? And that's because the concept of overcrowding and overabundance. I don't fully understand the link between the two, of course, as the study was quite confusing and some of that language is outdated. But ultimately, the fact that overabundance creates social situations where competition is not necessary, creating weak and fragmented societies where the individuals are that individuals and are unable to act as a group for the greater good. So what does this say about urbanization and humans, going to the last part? Well, it shows that urbanization has very obviously changed social roles and social norms, and this isn't always in a good way. This is because, by its nature, by its industrial nature and its very founding, these urban areas are atomizing. They're meant to be atomizing because that's what allows you as an industrial titan, for example, to control and better regulate the people involved in your factories. This was one of the original purposes and goals. It also allows for greater immigration, which is obviously immigration. Of course, we say diversity is our strength, but there's no way diversity cannot cause unity. These two things are, of course, contrary. Diversity can create synthesis, which can often be good or bad, right? But we've seen urbanization and abundance both take place all across modernity. And what this does is it creates these trends that we see that are reflected in mice. We see in the mice utopia lower birth rates. People are uninterested in mating. Beautiful ones, right? These are the people who are uninterested in anything except for themselves, not in a narcissistic way, because there's simply nothing to do, and they don't have the social fitting or standing to do so. You see alpha male culture. It's been very, very apparent for the last 2 and 3 years with figures like Andrew Tate, the Tate brothers, right, arising. And of course, that's more of a media trend. But their very appeal shows that that's something that people that we can see happening in real time. And there's just as many people who are meek. And obviously, if you look at the very most extreme examples, you have the kill all men feminists who are showing this sort of violent trend as abundance proliferates. So what I think this motor shows about humanity and just animal psychology, I think, is not that we turn into some monsters when there's abundance, is that the default state of the world is scarcity. Well, that's the number one rule of economics, that everything is scarce, right? We don't have enough. And that is because that was all of human history. All of human history has been on scarcity. Our social norms and expectations have been set up around that, right? If you want to go back, at least, if you want to go back to the caveman ages, scarcity necessitated males, at least in the human species, to grow stronger so they can be more aggressive and compete. And that was the norm, and that's what a lot of social structures arose and came into being, right? However, once that necessary need is completely eradicated, both sides just feel some sort of nihilism or lack of purpose, and possibly that could be a reason for the current situation we're seeing, where there's less partners, less births, more divorce rates, and an inability to connect with other people, loneliness, isolation, and these are some of the possible outcomes or outbreaks due to urbanization and over individualism. So what does this say? What are the lessons from modernity? What's the lessons we can take away from this utopian experiment? And it's that abundance without a vision is pointless. What makes humans unique is that we're not mice. We're not strictly affected by our psychological evolutionary needs. What makes humans special is that we are able to prioritize something, that despite abundance and despite these psychological trends, a vision of something greater drives us forwards. But that vision needs to be concrete and specific. A vision of simply progressing for progressing's sake isn't realistic. Neither is people being immortal, because we not only know that's not a good thing, it's also severely out of reach at the current moment. And personally, I see the one solution as being a fundamentalist religion. That doesn't promise happiness or utopia. Ideologies always promise utopia because it claims to account for everything. Ideologies like communism, for example, claim to understand the human condition in such a deep manner that they're able to fix all of our problems. But that's never the case. Religion tells us, at least in the Abrahamic religion, that the world is cruel, life's not fair, but there's still love out there for you. And this creates a higher purpose that despite abundance, that there's something that we're missing. Therefore, creating and fulfilling the set of needs that evolutionarily that we have, that scarcity is real, and it creates more value in life. So, can we as a society come to understand this and accept this, and perhaps, as I've been saying over some of the videos, have a third great awakening, whether that's a new religion, the rebirth of a new one, of an old one, or the reordainment of Christianity in America, for example? We don't know. But what this experiment of rat utopia does tell us and show us is that humans we aren't meant necessarily for huge urban populations into the millions and hundreds of millions, and that it's even been proven, scientifically, that we function the best in small groups where we understand our community members and have deep feelings for each of them. So, the takeaways for this is that rat utopia might reflect humanity, but because we're not mice, we have no obligation to fall for this trap. Thank you, and we hope you enjoyed the video. As always, if you have any comments, criticisms, critiques, or anything you want to talk about, or questions, please leave it in the comment sections below. I've been especially diligent recently with responses, but that'll be it for today. Rhetoric Reviewed, out.